welcome to the studio. Here I'm working on a special little painting, an 8 by 12 landscape depicting a really cool spot in the South Island of New Zealand. This is Skipper's Canyon, and I'm going to start things off here by lining up my composition, working with a synthetic filbert and a combination of burnt umber and quinacridone magenta. Now in this video, I've got some tips to share with you on how to create depth in a landscape painting. I've got 3 do's and 3 don'ts, and you better not be doing these 3 things that absolutely kill depth in a landscape. Let's start at the beginning. Do create a drawing and adhere to some form of perspective. You know, when we get the perspective wrong in our landscape, if our drawing's slightly off, and let's face it, it's pretty nice to have some good quality reference material, that can help. But if we get that drawing off, that's one thing that can absolutely kill our depth. Now things are going to be smaller the further away they are, and bigger towards the foreground. We know that. But it's about getting the size right with all those major shapes as the landscape recedes into space. Now, I really do like to take my time with my drawing, and I'm speeding this process up here so that you don't have to sit through the hours and hours that I spend doing these paintings. But when we take time and care and try and get everything lined up in the right place, we have something solid for the painting to hang off of. And once I'm happy with that drawing, then I start adding that color in. Even the best color and tonal values won't rescue a painting with a bad drawing. Now, when I'm chipping away in the studio, I like to take my time with things. And so I start working methodically from whatever's furthest away and bring the scene forward. Working in the sky first, because that's the most distant element in the painting. And then I start working on those background mountains. And then as I'm coming forward, you can see that things are gradually getting darker in those shadows. And also a little bit more intensity is coming through in some of those highlights. Just you wait until we start working on the hillside over on the left and also in the immediate foreground to the lower right. But there's a thing about tone, and if you watched my videos before, you would have heard me say this. But it's really important that we adhere to some sort of guidelines when working with value or tone within our painting. So do pay attention to the tones. Whether you're painting on plein air or looking closely at your reference material. Notice how those tones are so much darker in the shadows in the foreground as opposed to some of those areas in the background. This might not sound like much, but when you stick to this, you can create some real depth in a landscape painting. Don't not think about tone. Or get your tones completely out of whack by putting too dark of a tone in the background or having shadows that are too washed out in the foreground. Now, of course, you need to pay attention to the individual and unique lighting dynamic of the particular scene that you're painting. But in a scene like this, you'll notice from these references that are on the screen that those shadows are pretty dark comparatively from the background working all the way towards the front. So, do pay attention to that tonal dynamic and don't get them out of whack. Now, I'm often painting these little scenes because I'm thinking about bigger paintings that I want to create in the studio. Now, I want to finish this off as a fully realized and resolved painting, but I am thinking about painting this again at scale. It really helps me to do all of my thinking here at a smaller scale, work out my colors, work out the composition, and how that light falls across the forms of these hills. I also think about little moments in the painting, like the light glinting off the snow here in the distant mountains. I like going quite detailed for these little paintings, and one thing that helps me achieve that miniature detail applied with some synthetic riggers like the ivory rigger and also some of these synthetic filberts like this evergreen filbert that I'm using right here. One thing that really helps is having a tight weave on the linen. So I use a linen called Bell Arty 42 OP. I'm going to put a link to it in the description down below. Now, I'm based in New Zealand, so I order mine in from Australia, but you can probably find a really good artist quality fine weave linen where you are. Just do a bit of research online. Now, this linen really helps me achieve some nice, tight, and fine detail without that heavy texture of the weave getting in the way of the tiny little marks that I like to apply at this small scale. I find that too much texture is a bit overbearing and it gets in the way of my brushwork, especially at this scale. Now, in the past, I've had a process that was more or less 3 steps: blocking in, modeling, and detail. But more and more, I'm playing with a process that is just 2 steps: the block in with a little more finesse, and then detail right over the top. I'm finding that I can produce paintings a bit faster using this method. And then if there is a third pass at all, it's for atmospheric effects like glazing, perhaps adding some weather or mist, or even adjusting my shadows and highlights with a light tint, perhaps some transparent yellow oxide or something like that, to just create a bit more of a cohesive color dynamic. So again, it's just a block in with a little bit more effort put in to really push it as far as I can in that initial phase, and then I go over the top with those finer details. Now, I find that adjusting my approach with some of these smaller works has really sped me up, and I'm coming out with a fresher painting, at least in my opinion anyway. So we've already talked about some do's and some don'ts. So do create a drawing and adhere to some form of perspective. Pay really close attention to those forms and the linear quality of your painting. And also do really pay attention to your tonal dynamic over the vast distance that you're trying to communicate. Remember that your shadow is going to appear so much lighter in the background. Now, time for the third tip, and that is do pay very close attention to color. Now, one thing you'll notice here is that the colors vary a great deal between the shadow areas here in the immediate foreground and the high-lit slopes with all of this beautiful grass catching that sunlight and that distance. Here in the immediate foreground, so much more red, yellows, and oranges are coming through in that grass. There's quite a lot of heat there, but as it goes into the distance, that yellow drops away, along with the oranges and the reds. This is important because red, orange, and yellow don't travel well over distance. Now, if we look at the color wheel, like you can see here on the screen, everything at the top half of that color wheel tends to give way and take a backseat to some of the colors on the bottom half of this color wheel. And so here, you'll notice that the only colors that are going to make it in that distance are going to be your violets and your blues. And even green is going to be a real tricky one, because in painting, green, as we know, is made up of a combination of blue and yellow. So that yellow tends to drop away and our colors start to shift more blue and violet over that distance. So you'll notice here with the color, again, that intensity of yellow, red, and orange is so much more prominent here in the foreground, and it completely drops away as we get into the distant mountains. In fact, to achieve some of those distant colors, I was only using burnt umber in combination with ultramarine blue and white. So do pay very close attention to your color dynamic and how it works over a vast space. And don't get too saturated in the distance. If you have too much color in those distant reaches, particularly your reds, oranges, and yellows, you absolutely kill your depth. Now, this is a thing I really love about painting, and it's the opportunity to create something three-dimensional with full form, bathed in light on a two-dimensional surface. How on earth do we do that? Well, I'm telling you right now, it's all about observing and adhering to those do's and avoiding those don'ts. It might sound overly simplistic, but I'm telling you, it really works. Now, thanks so much for watching. I'll see you again in the next video.